Our story starts with greenhouse gas emissions. These, measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, come from emitters like factories and power plants, or homes and cars where fuel is combusted. Those greenhouse gas emissions enter the atmosphere and contribute to climate change. The state of California passed a bill to try and decrease its contribution to climate change. One part of that bill is to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that enter the atmosphere. Regulators set a cap on emissions. Power plants, industry, cars, and trucks can collectively only emit a certain amount, and that amount decreases each year. For every ton of CO2 equivalent under the cap, that is allowed to be emitted, there is just that, an allowance. Each allowance represents the right to emit 1 ton of CO2e. They are called California Carbon Allowances, or CCAs, and can be traded among emitters. We will take you through the life and times of one such CCA, our friend Tony the Ton. Regulators at the California Air Resources Board, the body that runs the state's cap-and-trade program, issue a certain amount of CCAs per year. Many of them are allocated directly to emitters based on their historic emissions levels. If those companies emit more than the number of allowances they have, they'll need to buy more from somebody who emitted less. In Tony's case, regulators allocated him to a tomato processing plant that emits greenhouse gases because it combusts fossil fuels to run its equipment. Compliance officers at the tomato processing plant put Tony the Ton and all the other allowances they receive into a holding account that the California Air Resources Board has set up for them. Allowances can go in and out of the holding account as needed. The company can add more allowances to cover its emissions, or take some out of its account and sell them if it doesn't need so many allowances. In Tony's case, the tomato processing plant installed solar panels and biomass generation that used refuse from the tomato plants, which greatly reduced the amount of fossil fuel combustion and therefore the greenhouse gas emissions. The plant didn't need as many allowances as it had been allocated because it had fewer emissions to cover. They were able to sell Tony and the others to someone who emitted a lot and wanted to buy allowances. The company hired a broker who found a large emitter, a utility with lots of fossil fuel-fired power generation that wanted to buy lots of allowances to cover all those emissions. She made a deal in which the utility paid the tomato processing plant for Tony and the other extra allowances. So Tony ended up heading to the utility in another part of California. The holding account at the utility was similar to the one at the tomato processing plant. Tony joined the other compliance units in the account. They were all like him, representing 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. But there was someone else in the holding account. Olive, the offset.
You don't look like you're from around here. Are you also one of the 165 million tons allowed to be emitted this year?
No, I'm from the countryside. I originate outside the sectors covered by the greenhouse gas emissions cap. I represent 1 ton of CO2e that was not emitted in those sectors, so I offset emissions of the factories and plants whose owners buy me.
How does that work, this offsetting?
Well, in an animal feeding operation, animal effluent usually goes into a waste lagoon where it emits lots of the potent greenhouse gas methane. This contributes to climate change, and the agricultural sector is not covered by the cap, so has little incentive to install expensive equipment to reduce those emissions. In the offset project I come from, the operators covered the waste lagoon and trapped the methane, which is the main component of natural gas, and were able to use it as fuel to run turbines. This reduced the amount of greenhouse gas entering the atmosphere compared to the scenario without the project. The operators were able to finance the project with the money from the sale of the offsets it generated, like me.
Neat. I wonder what's going to happen to us next.
Me too. Maybe we'll stay in this holding account together for a while.
But the utility company had other ideas. It wanted to cut down on its emissions so it wouldn't need so many allowances and offsets, and could instead make money selling them to someone who did. It increased the amount of renewable generation in its portfolio, which meant that it emitted less overall, and, like the tomato plant, ended up having a surplus of compliance units to sell. So many, in fact, that rather than working with a broker, the utility sold a big batch of compliance units to an exchange. Exchanges are big anonymous trading platforms where large lots of allowances or offsets are sold in one contract. There are many different types of contracts. Tony was part of a spot contract, a batch of 1,000 tons. Tony was surprised to see that his contract was selling for a higher price than Olive's batch of 1,000 offsets.
But we both represent the same thing, the right to emit 1 ton of CO2e. Why are you selling for less than I am?
We offsets always sell at a discount to allowances. There is a limit on the extent to which emitters can use us for compliance. The California regulators want to make sure that the main emission reductions come from within a company. Therefore, you allowances sell at a premium because they can use you no matter what. There is always a difference between the cost of allowances and offsets. It's called the spread.
But while Olive was explaining this, Tony and the 999 other allowances in his lot were transacted. They were purchased by a refinery. The refinery is owned by an oil and gas firm. The firm has to surrender allowances for the emissions caused when all the gas it sells is combusted, for instance, when we drive our cars. The refinery can't do much to reduce those emissions, so it almost always needs more allowances and offsets, anything it can get. The oil and gas company needed to surrender the compliance units in its holding account in order to cover its emissions. Tony was one of these units. He left the holding account, but instead of going to another holding account at another facility, he went to the oil and gas firm's compliance account. Once placed in the compliance account, units cannot leave again. They have been surrendered to regulators, who retire them because the right to emit 1 ton of CO2 has been used. The California Air Resources Board retired Tony the Ton. And there ends his life story.